So, welcome to our final panel of this conference, comments and conclusions. It's going to be an enormous challenge for our participants after such an intensive set of panels to try to sum up at least some of their impressions. We have invited Natalia, Aleksiun, Norbert, Frei, and Mary Fulbrook to start the discussion by giving a couple of general impressions in about 5 to maximum 10 minutes each. And we will then try to enter into a broader discussion and open the floor to general comments and questions also from the audience via the chat, as we have, according to established procedures, which have worked quite well during the last days. So let me just briefly introduce Natalia Aleksiun. She's professor of modern Jewish history at Touro College in New York. Among her publications, I would mention a book published already in 2002 in Polish, Where to? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950. Numerous edited volumes and articles on a broad range of aspects of Jewish life and culture before, during, and after the Second World War in Europe. And most recently, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, which came out this year. It has been a great joy to have you here in Jena for almost 2 years now with interruptions, Natalia, and it's also great to have you here to this concluding panel of our conference. So welcome to you, and Sybille Steinbacher will now introduce our other two participants.
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Norbert Frei to you. He's professor of modern history at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena and director of the Jena Center 20th Century History. Norbert Frei got various honors and guest professorships, for example, in Princeton at the New School for Social Research in New York, where he was the Theodor Heuss professor, for example, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at the Stanford University. Norbert Frei is the author of several books on the Nazi period and on German history. I just mentioned 2 of his publications. Many of them were translated in several languages. I want to just mention his book, National Socialist Rule in Germany, the Führer State, and his book in English, the title is Adenauer's Germany and the Nazi Past, The Politics of Amnesty and Integration. And his newest book, which he co-authored, came out in 2019. The title in German is Zur rechten Zeit, wieder die Rückkehr des Nationalismus. Thank you all. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Norbert. Thank you, Mary, for joining this conference now for the 3rd day and for giving us your comments. We already introduced Mary Fulbrook, who is one of our 2 keynote speakers, so we will not introduce Mary again now. We will start now with the comments, and the first commentator is Natalia Aleksiun, followed by Norbert Frei, and then followed by Mary Fulbrook. Please, Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sybille, and thank you, Joachim. And it's an honor to be in such a distinguished company at this virtual table. And I thought that the chairs over the 3 days a difficult task, presenting in short words very rich papers. But yes, indeed, our task is enormous. So let me just share with you some thoughts. And as I was listening to the papers and to the discussions, what Mary actually shared with us in the keynote speech about the disappearance of complicity, of the discourse of this complicity, and this to counter processes was very much in my head as I was listening to the papers. And I thought that, in a way, this conference brought together Holocaust and Cold War, culture and justice, showing how very productive these can be discussed together, and putting them together sheds light on actors, on audiences, on agencies, on aesthetics, on geographies, on temporalities, on continuities, shifts, and turning points. And I'll just mention a few things that jumped at me, as it were. One was how nuanced Eastern Europe emerges from this conversation. We several times referred to that, these differences between Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but there is so much more in the projects that are still ongoing. There is the question of diaspora, so we kind of transcend even the political borders of post-war Europe. In Audrey's papers, in some other papers, we looked beyond national borders and beyond Eastern European and Iron Curtain at regions, right? The new territories, the old territories, the shifting borders. And then there's a question of actors, especially for me, from the perspective of my work, the victims, both dead and alive, both that are present in the courtrooms, in commemorations, but also ghost-like presence. And this goes to another theme that I think was very much present, as it were, throughout the papers, which is absence and presence, presence in absence, absence in presence. And I thought that it was interesting that, unlike in many conferences on post-war justice, Jews as actors, and very nuanced actors, not one Jewish voice, not one institutional Jewish voice, how present these were as actors and as contributors to the various discourses, partially counter discourses, in both cultural production and in legal matters. And then I thought that the one interesting absent present actor was Israel as a state, as its agencies, as individual lawyers. We didn't have a specific paper or panel, but it was coming back again and again. And so these two aspects I thought were extremely interesting. Then there is a question of a performative aspect of both culture and justice, as in the title of the conference. And this goes to, of course, trials. And Nadej Ragaru wrote fascinating work about it. There's some more looking at trials as performance, but there was also discussion of it on commemorations, but also research and plays that are staged. I had been taken to see The Germans, that was discussed in one of the presentations several times as a schoolgirl, and responses of the audience to all these cultural and political rituals. In chronology, of course, I think we bid big goodbye to the myth of silence throughout multiple papers. And again, this what Hanna Kubatova argued about Czechoslovakia and Slovakia specifically applies to so many papers, that absence that is a very active kind of a public discourse that is not denial. And so I think this is a framework that really could be then very creatively applied, not just to the immediate first decade, but also into the 60s, and see how this changes, how avoidance is also an active form of, in a way, engaging. Public space, and what I thought was interesting, it was much more present, as it were, in questions than in actual paper, was the private space. And I think multiple participants commented on the difficulty of knowing, really getting into the private responses, private consumption of all these cultural and legal rituals, performances, and productions. And last but not least, as a historian, I thought it was interesting to see in how many of the papers there was also a self-reflection on the methodological questions and challenges, on the materials that we are all using or craving to see and can't see. I was thrilled to see how many of us are missing archives and waiting to return to the files that are waiting for us. And I thought that today, especially, that call for internationalization of the conversation and bringing together historiographies that was present yesterday as well, especially in a paper on Holocaust literature, that it takes us again into the community of scholars and network of scholars that is part of the subject of this conference, and ongoing networks of production and exchange of knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. And I hope these are just the points Norbert will pick up on.
Yeah, thank you. My very first impression, this was a rather intense and rich conference, and I'm really grateful for many insightful contributions we heard in these 2 days. I have just 3 points for the beginning, I mean, Natalia just spoke of an enormous task. I think it would be an impossible task to bring everything together here in 5 minutes or so. And this is why I decided not to go into any individual paper, despite the fact that there are many of them which I would like to comment on. But let me start with 3 brief points. The first goes back to the title of the conference. As one would expect, most contributors tried to connect their individual theme to the term Cold War. And in a lot of cases, we indeed learned that the Cold War, and I quote from the conference flyer, conditioned, framed, and formed the histories of the Holocaust. However, in this flyer, the period of the Cold War is defined as the period between 1945 and 1990. I have to say, I was a bit surprised by this broad definition, and I wondered what would happen during the conference. Well, my impression during the last 2 days was that quite many of the contributors also saw a need to define Cold War more restrictively. In any case, many contributions focused on a much shorter period of time, be it the second half of the 40s and the early 50s, or because of the special focus we had on the Eichmann trial on the 60s. And that seems to me to be something that is probably worth emphasizing here at this final panel. The end of the conference title, the end between Holocaust and Cold War, establishes too vague a connection. I think we need a much more specific periodization. We need to look at the period of Stalinism separately from the early 1960s, and we need to look more closely, for instance, into the period of the Helsinki process, a period for which it seems much more difficult to establish a meaningful connection between the Holocaust and the political relations between Eastern Europe and the West. This brings me very brief to my second point. Maybe I wasn't paying close attention enough, but I missed the explicit use of the term instrumentalization. Of course, implicitly, there was a lot of talk about instrumentalization, especially when we were talking about the post-war criminal trials. What purpose did the trials serve beyond punishing crimes that society cannot and will not live with unpunished? Nadesh Ragahu reminded us of this once again today. We have to look into the specific societal situations. There were social demands which are different from the needs and mechanisms of propaganda and of Cold War politics during the high period of Stalinism. So in other words, I would argue, well, we probably should make more of a counter test to look how much of the developments and events we were talking about did not relate to the fact that there is this huge concept, this huge political situation called Cold War. My last point relates to the societal needs after the Holocaust, which are by no means defined only by the emerging Cold War. And in that way, it connects to the question of instrumentalization. Here, I want to tie in with what Mary Fulbrook said in her keynote address. In her comparison between the development in the GDR and in the Federal Republic, which on the whole, Mary, to me, seemed to be a bit too favorable for the GDR. But this is comes probably not as a surprise to you. In this comparison, Mary spoke of the Cold War as of the framework that had helped the perpetrators. That, of course, is out of doubt. Just think about the Action Paperclip or the Soviet version of it, or think of the Red Lines to South America via the Vatican. So, I mean, yes, there is the framework Cold War that helps the perpetrators. But I would like to remind you that West Germany's Vergangenheitspolitik, the policy of the past, did not need the upcoming Cold War in order to be conceived. It was not just a concept of the Adenauer government, but supported practically by the entire political class of the new established Federal Republic, especially when it came to the so-called war convicts, which in fact were the sentenced war criminals of the Allied military trials and the Nuremberg trial and so on. The societal needs for exculpation, which were expressed in this Vergangenheitspolitik, came up much earlier than the Cold War, as it was true with the talk of a Schlussstrich, a final balance under the past. And these needs actually were hardly different between East and West Germany. And I'm sure you know that despite all the confrontational propaganda in the early stages of the Cold War, there were significant parallels between the Federal Republic and the GDR when it came to the question of amnesties. So this is just a plea for, maybe it's a bit unfair after such an effort for 2.5 days, but it's sort of a plea against the explanatory power of Cold War when we are talking about European societies after the Holocaust.
Thank you very much, Norbert. And now, Mary Fulbrook, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Well, both the previous commentators have touched on points that I also wanted to raise. I have basically 4 headings. Periodization was the first one, and this was raised, I think, in Joachim von Puttkamer's opening remarks, the question of periodization and caesura and so on. I think periodization always depends on what is the focus of interest. And it seems to me that what came up during the course of the conference was at least 4 different levels of things we might be writing narratives of that would require different kinds of periodization. The first one, obviously, from the title of the conference, is the Cold War. And here I absolutely agree with what Norbert Frei just said. And I had noted down that even within the Cold War, there seemed to be quite different kinds of periodization coming up in different areas of both Eastern and Western Europe, whether it's the dating of the imposition of communism, whether it's the dating of de-Stalinization, whether it's détente and its significance, whether it's anti-Semitic campaigns in 1952 or 1968, whether it's increasing cooperation between different states in the period of détente and the 1970s particularly. So all of these international issues have different kinds of periodization, both broadly across Europe, East and West, and within different states on either side of the Iron Curtain. But there are also national periodizations, and here again, and I agree absolutely with what Norbert just said, there are everywhere needs for reintegration, for amnesties, for so-called purification, as the French called it, for different kinds of saying we have to live together, so how are we going to do this? And again, this gets inflected slightly differently in different areas of Europe. But there are national periodizations which have to do with specific aspects of different locations within East or West. Then thirdly, I think something that wasn't periodized quite so well, but was implicit in a number of papers was, sorry, this is thirdly under my first point. I'm going to try and keep the other points shorter, but the first one I had 4 points within it. There is the question of the periodization of popular opinion. And here I think it wasn't made explicit enough that there are significant questions of generational change involved when we're talking about this. The question of late 1960s, 1970s discourses changing. We're talking about the shifting away from positions of power and influence of an older generation, the coming up of younger generations who see things differently, and generational challenges by the 70s and 80s, which I don't think came out very strongly, but were implicit in quite a few places. And finally, the one which I found most interesting, actually, which was a subtle thread that ran throughout, but we might want to tackle it head on, is the question of persisting anti-Semitism, whether it's anti-Semitism at the popular level or whether it's state-sponsored, if you like, anti-Semitism and the relationship between that and anti-Zionism. And that related also to the myth of silence, which Natalia already started with, the question of whether people were actually silenced. In my book Reckonings, I actually explain this slightly differently, where I think that what characterizes the early post-war years is that you only find a receptive audience within your own community of experience or even your own wider community of identification, but there isn't the talking across different communities. And so it's only a perception of silence from the perspective of those who are tracing what's being talked about in a particular dominant community and not what is being talked about unter uns, as it were, among people like oneself. So my second point relates very directly to that. I think one of the themes that came out in a number of papers is the question of how communities are constructed and what are the relationships between different kinds of communities. In one paper, for example, well, both in the a paper on France and a paper on Czechoslovakia, it became very clear that there are distinct differences among survivor communities between the Jewish and the non-Jewish survivors. And depending on what the wider environment is, one or the other kind of community may have to subordinate its own particularities and its own desire to talk about its story to integration in the wider sphere. Particularly, I think this goes for in many areas, but certainly in France, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, the specificity of the Jewish experience gets subordinated to other survivor experiences. Then quite obviously, there is the major difference between Jews and what is sometimes called the non-Jewish majority populations. The majority society term works much better in German, I think, than in English, so I'm always a bit wary of it. But there's quite clear a really significant question here, which came out in a number of papers about intimate violence, neighbours, the robbery of property and houses, the recent memory of denunciations and betrayals, and how those returning survivors now interact with their former neighbours on the local level. And here questions of justice or revenge or forgiveness or silencing and going away play out quite differently than they do in the courtrooms and in the major trials that have been much of the focus. And I think that was interesting because that did come out particularly in some of the papers on culture. Less so obviously on the trials questions, but I think they're really important for that too, when we're dealing with little trials in the first post-war years compared to the major concentration camp and major perpetrator trials later on. And the thing that really struck me as interesting about bringing together culture and justice, as this conference did, is that it gave us a way to think about the relationships between power structures, state circumstances, and discourses to which people have to adapt through the post-war decades in order to accommodate themselves in the light of their own priorities, which might be quite personal and quite distinctive. My third point then is really about the wider relationships between culture, justice, and what Natalia already picked up on, the private sphere, because we've got a lot of very good papers on specific trials and who was involved in them, what the intentions were, what the outcomes were. We had then slightly less on the wider impact of these trials. We could talk about propagandistic intentions, but not necessarily how these were received, particularly among Eastern European populations. We had quite a lot of really interesting presentations on cultural representations, but we had far less about how people talked about these things, let alone what the impact might have been within families over generations. And I think this is an area which, if we really want to understand post-war European culture and justice, we really have to find ways of exploring more intensively and more systematically. My final and fourth point that I thought really came out incredibly well in the papers across the conference is the relationship between key individual actors, networks, and the state or wider political circumstances, because it was quite obvious that certain individual actors played a major role, whether we're talking about Fritz Bauer in the West, Karl Cowell in the East, Imre Kertész as a writer, Helmut Eschwege as a sort of lone historian, and so on. Networks across borders and across the Iron Curtain really stand out as very, very important. So the initiative of individuals is in many respects almost more important than what are particular state interests or state constraints. I think the states kind of have more constraints, but the room for maneuver, as somebody put it, is really, really essential. And I think the glaring elephant in the room, if I can use that metaphor, the thing we didn't talk about directly, and Norbert just brought it out now, is the Federal Republic. We did not really have a full-on look at West Germany and what it was up to. I don't think, I mean, I would be very happy to engage in a much longer discussion about the GDR, but I think one of the problems we have in looking at East Germany versus West Germany is very often there is an implicit assumption that what West Germany did was legal and what East Germany did was political instrumentalization. And I think it would be helpful to look more closely at West German trials as well, in terms of who defined what law was to be applied when, what were the struggles. Norbert, of all people, knows this better than anyone here, that it is also a politicized legal system and legal practices. And I think the what he just mentioned as the need, societal need for exculpation, is really important, but you can't look at that without looking at the power structures and whose voices were silenced or whose agendas were in some respects hindered and obstacles were put in the way of. So I think the need for focusing on what we actually think is a good way of trials, justice, coming to terms with the past, it needs more explicit focus, and not just somehow leaving the center of the prime initiator of the Holocaust out of a sort of, it seemed to me we had a donut with a missing center in the conference, because we had a lot on Eastern Europe, a little bit on Western Europe, not much of Western Europe, and then there was this sort of missing center of the perpetrator nation par excellence, except in its little rump bit of East Germany, which was a fascinating session where I'd have a lot more to say about the GDR session, but I won't. So that's my opening remarks about the conference as a whole, and thank you very much for organizing such an extraordinarily extensive conference in this way and under these conditions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for these insightful and challenging comments. Particularly what you said at the end, Mary, I could try to pitch you against Norbert, who just said you don't need the GDR or the Cold War to understand what happened in the Adenauer period. It worked all along in the inner West German logic, but that's not what I'm aiming at. What I would rather like to ask you is, we've heard so much from the three of you and from the many papers that blurred the differences between East and West, that looked at the role of key actors, at the role of state propaganda, anti-fascism serving exculpatory needs. Jan Tomáš Gross in his keynote, I think, could be easily interpreted in that way. Parts of what we heard about Hungary, Czechoslovakia could equally go along these lines. Transnational networks. So are we not in danger of sort of, in German one would say, das Kind mit dem Bade ausschütten, of highlighting the similarities when for such a long time we've understood or taken it for granted that the Cold War in East and West sort of marked differences, substantial differences. Are we not sort of in danger of going a bit too far? Haven't we heard quite a lot also during this conference about, as Norbert said, instrumentalizations, which worked along different lines, East and West, regardless of whether we substitute or take Cold War as a substitute for looking towards the East or state socialism. Natalia, please. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I should be able to unmute myself in my sleep after this year. I thought actually there was two interesting directions in which this conference went, because yes, on the one hand, we had this immensely fascinating circulation of especially cultural production, but also documents, proofs, know-how, legal know-how, that at times it was really possible to kind of not see the Iron Curtain hanging there. And on the other hand, the ways in which Holocaust was made useful in state discourse or in court discourse, it was interesting how much these were steeped in Cold War realities. So I thought I learned in both ways how this can be in a way dismantled and at the same time put back in, depending on the kind of angle from which we were looking. But I wanted to add to what Mary just said, that what also wasn't explicit, maybe except for Hanna Kubatova's paper, but it wasn't a leading theme. But I think we know it's there, is the history of emotions. I think that it would be interesting to think of what from all these components we would get if we try to also take this as a lens. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Norbert, please.
Yeah, may I just can connect to what Natalia just said about history of emotions. I don't know whether I need this phrasing or framing, but the point you are making here, if we go back to the very early stages after the war, and this was to be seen so impressively by these war crimes exhibitions, the early exhibitions, how much emotion, how much need in these groups of liberated people was to document and to present and to confront the majority society with what happened to them. And this as something which also, on the other hand, reacts to each other. I mean, we learned that the Warsaw exhibition kind of answered to the Paris exhibition. I think this is fascinating. But this has nothing to do with the Cold War. And this is something which actually asks for a periodization which takes these very early years as something in its own dignity and importance. And I mean, there are consequences of this strong voice of the survivors in the very first moment. One of the consequences is that they become silenced immediately thereafter, by the majority. But there is this moment of articulation, and I wouldn't subsume what we heard about these interesting things, and this is really empirically new stuff, for me at least. I wouldn't subsume this as cultural or cultural sphere. I mean, this is immediate societal need. Yeah, and so this is one situation in which we probably should not look for too broad and too general periodizations concepts, but look at the dignity of a historical situation. I mean, 30, 40 years earlier, we were talking about the Stunde Null, yeah? Well, in a way, here something comes back, yeah?
Yes, thank you very much for your comments and also for your critique and, well, your comments on the insufficiencies of the conference. Of course, it is an experiment, and we told you we planned 2 conferences and we merged it to one. And of course, we did not talk about the West. We did not talk about the United States. We did not talk about West Germany. So we did not talk about the Cold War, of course. We just talked about the Eastern European countries. And we concentrated on the 60s. It's absolutely true. But I think concerning this time of this period, we got a lot of highly interesting information, also concerning periodization, I'd say. For example, I'm wondering, what can we say about the role of the Eichmann trial in the Eastern European countries? Was it a starting point for something totally new? Was it an event which accelerated something which already began before in the late 1950s? What was the role of the Eichmann trial? I'd be interested in your opinion on that. And concerning periodization, I think things changed in the Eastern European countries already at the end of the 1960s, after some years only, maybe in Poland in 1967 or 1968, when this massive wave of anti-Semitism began. So what can we say? Is it just a small period when things changed, when the arts, literature and films say something on this topic, and when the trials took place? So is this a period we have to keep in mind? And what's the role of the Eichmann trial?
Maybe with regard to the Eichmann trial and the absence of the GDR less, but also the GDR, but particularly the Federal Republic in this conference. I was just attending another conference on the Eichmann trial by Yad Vashem a couple of weeks earlier, And there, my basic argument was that the Eichmann trial, the West German reception of the Eichmann trial, was overestimated in the last couple of years. If we look in the empirical situation, of course, Ulm is before the Einsatzkommandoprozess in Ulm, and afterwards the Auschwitz trial is much more important in Germany than the Eichmann trial. But it seems already rather difficult to argue that way, given the fact what an enormous impact the Eichmann trial had in actually in the situation, within the situation in the United States, and also in Israel, of course. Just the fact that each session was broadcasted, and then later on, I mean, the culture which or the image of the Eichmann trial, the man in the glass case, this became so enormous and so strong in the decades thereafter that it's hard to get back to the situation at the time where, yes, it was important in Israel, yes, it was very important in the US, but it was already less important in the public sphere. I'm not talking about the political system. I'm not talking about the Adenauer government. I'm talking about the public sphere in West Germany. And also, since the GDR realized that they won't be able to make their point there against the Federal Republic, it was also not that important in the GDR. But and my impression is that this is generally not so different from most of Eastern Europe.
Natalia, please.
So I want to very much follow up on what Norbert just said. First of all, on this historical dignity of the immediate post-war period, I couldn't agree more. And I think that this is slightly a danger of the internationalization of perspective on taking wonderful 3 steps back and going global, because again, from my impression in Poland, the trials of Nazi criminals that were that ended up in Polish courts, that Gabriel Finder and Alexander Prusin wrote about, and there is more research, and in the August decree trials, that this is much more relevant to the public discourse, and Jewish survivors testify in those trials. So the fact that people are able to voice their experiences it's not unheard of. Of course, there are limitations and there is negotiation in what you can say and how you phrase it. But I think it doesn't. And Audrey's paper, which actually this I'm very excited about this project. Audrey, I'm waving at you right now. This is fascinating to see how much the dynamic is a function of appearing Jewish survivors, those that leave in 1956, and then there is a new repatriation from the Soviet Union, and there are new moments of recognizing your neighbor, your neighborly perpetrator. So it's interesting because it's completely unconnected. Now, I don't know if anyone researched that, but it would be interesting to see. I'm interested in intimate history, so it would be interesting to see what kind of correspondence, personal, familial correspondence comes out of Israel, where without a doubt, it makes a profound impression. So what people who have families still in Eastern Europe, if they write, what do they write about it? But I think it's a different periodization. I agree.
Thank you. And on this, I think it's difficult not to agree that the immediate post-war years until 1947, 48, things worked along different lines. The question here would be, and they have their own dignity and their own social needs. And the question here would be, do we need the Cold War to explain why these developments then ended? I think, Norbert, it was you who said they were being cut short by the Cold War. One could also say that the reconstitution of survivor communities, at least for Poland, was stopped short by emigration. And whether this emigration had to do with the onset of communist dictatorship and the Cold War is a question to be discussed. It's not obvious, I would say. Still, I have the impression that if we look at the way how a systemic confrontation and mutual perceptions influence the way societies East and West, not globally, but East and West engaged with or addressed the Holocaust, it's much easier to argue for the relevance of the Cold War for the early period, in spite of everything we heard, that is from the very late 40s throughout the 50s into the 60s, than it would be for the following decades. In an earlier conversation with Sybille Steinbacher, I even went so far as to say it was just Eastern Europe that still lived in the Cold War from the early 1970s onwards, whereas in the US, Israel, and West Germany developed social developments which concern us here were definitely not posited or so much influenced by what was happening in Eastern Europe anymore. But for the 50s and 60s, I would sort of stick to the relevance of a systemic confrontation, to put it that way.
No, just to clarify that, I mean, the 50s and the 60s, yes, whatever is talked about the Second World War and the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews and what followed thereafter with German refugees, etc. All of this cannot be understood. I mean, these confrontations cannot be understood without the needs of for propaganda for during the because of the Cold War. This is absolutely clear, but then one could as well argue, well, then let's keep the notion of Cold War as we had it in the, let's say, in the 80s, when nobody conceived the period we were living in as Cold War, or at best as a second Cold War or something. Yeah.
Mary, please.
Yeah, this is why I said at the outset, I think we have to think very hard about the periodization of the Cold War, because actually, if you think about the period from 61 to 79, it's quite different from the 50s up to the Berlin crisis and the Berlin Wall, and the situation from 79 onwards with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Ronald Reagan coming in the 80s, the whole new mini Cold War, the arms race and so on. Those are quite different phases. And one could argue, if you want to correlate that chronology of the Cold War with the chronology of both trials and cultural representations of the Holocaust, you could see the trials, as Annette Weinke did brilliantly in her book on the German comparison, the trials of the early 1960s being very much stimulated by Cold War competition between the two states, in a quite different way from the early 1950s, so that West Germany and East Germany both were constantly having to show each other that they were the better at overcoming the past. But then the dribbling away of trials, because they were less important, less significant. I think we've left Austria entirely out of this, but you know, we can talk about that too. In the 70s could in part be seen because the Cold War competition was no longer so acute. I think what is then important, and which we didn't, to my mind, throw in very strongly, was what the Cold War means for collective self-representations in the 1980s and the growing crossing of boundaries for cultural representations. I'm thinking here Claude Lanzmann, for example, who went down much more badly in Poland than he did in Western Europe because he appeared to portray Polish complicity in a way that has continued and continued and continued, and we see in the last few years in Poland more acutely again. So these kinds of phases of the Cold War do actually affect different phases of both culture and juridical attempts to deal with the past. So we do have to put the different periodizations together, but they are different periodizations. And I think acute systemic confrontation and competition is a different one from the implications of the Cold War for those states that are most constrained in terms of what they can do domestically, i.e. the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, and less so in the West. But it is inflected on both sides, and it's had an impact on the populations and the way in which they're prepared to talk about things and see things. If I can just, while I'm talking, briefly come back to emotions and the early post-war years, I think what you get in the early post-war years, this incredible outpouring of grief and anger and desire to commemorate and desire to go back in a way that then becomes no longer possible in some areas, is clamped down on, is shut up, is changed and transformed through the 50s in different structural circumstances. But the emotions don't go away. And I think this is one of the really interesting things that we have to understand about the justice is about a sense of trying to put things right again that were wrong, restitution for wrongs done to one. And that emotional impetus doesn't necessarily go away throughout a person's lifetime. It's just that they may just feel eventually they can't do it anymore, or they want another memorial here, but they're not going to pursue that legal claim there, or whatever it may be. So I think we have to put these things together, the very big and the very tiny and individual.
Thank you.
Natalia, before you answer, I see that Nadesh Ragaru wants to ask a question. Just for you, Nadesh Ragaru, please write your question in the chat so that we can see it. Okay, Natalia, please, go ahead.
So very much, again, following up on what Mary just said, because I was thinking what about your earlier comment about generational shift, which of course is very important to keep in mind, especially in the 60s with new generation coming to play a role, even if it's play a role by not remembering, ostensibly not remembering what we heard from Jan Gross on the first day. But I was thinking about the biographical longue durée, lives lived, right? And if we were to look at Marek Edelman, right, as an author of a official Bundes narrative of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as a member of various formal and informal bodies, including Jewish self-defense very early on in the post-war, then as a person who integrates, who sort of functions, as this incredibly important cardiologist saving lives and tending to the graves, as he explained why he stays. And then he is the center of counter commemorative events in front of Rappaport Memorial that are, in a way, also a very useful ritual that involves the Holocaust and Polish anti-communist opposition. So, and this is within a span of one life. So I don't have the answer. I just think that what Mary, what you just suggested, is that this impetus, as you put it, is something that matters even when we don't see, someone that takes a local perpetrator, tries to take a local perpetrator to court, or someone that doesn't quite erect a memorial. And then there is the physical aspect, which is quite obvious, but I'll just say it, in the ways that Cold War does matter, which is that people, as far as Jewish victims are concerned, especially if we're looking at Poland, these are that survivors are increasingly not on so-called Polish soil, right? there's all those waves. And so all the commemorative acts and all the emotional impetus of remembering and mourning and commemorating, all this is happening already from a distance. And the mentions of leaving a testimony in a Polish consulate in New York, in a Polish consulate in Washington, in Israel, I think that these are also glimpses into something very important that belongs to our broader conversation.
Okay, thank you. So let's come to the comment from Ms. Ragaru. She's writing, first, Eastern European focus, second, about the Cold War and socialism, third, about individualities and how studying them may offer a contribution about the intertwining between culture and law. This would require the possibility to speak, not write. Thank you all for your marvelous comments. Thank you very much, Nadège Ragaru, for this comment and for this remark.
I think, Sybille, this is a painful remark on the limits of our technical possibilities at this moment. We should have the opportunity to give her the microphone, which we don't have here, but we do have it in the gathering, in the Wonder conference, which is going to be opened right afterwards, and maybe we will have the opportunity to continue discussions there. Yes, but as we're coming towards the end, in any way, there's quite a lot which I'm taking from your comments, and particularly what I've been thinking of is the way Mary Fulbrook just argued for periodizations, and how we can we actually establish a closer link between the Cold War as not just a systemic, but also, the periodizations of the Cold War as a systemic and foreign policy confrontation. If one thinks about it in terms of the decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, I think there are some instances where this is, can be more easily done than for others. We've had several mentions in the presentations of the 6 Days War in 1967. I think there one can, in dissolving the constellation or reshaping, which we've been speaking about, which we could argue, I would have great difficulties in linking the Eichmann trial with the Cuban Missile Crisis, to sort of go carrying it a bit too far, or the Slansky trial with the Korean War. But that's probably also not what you meant. But I do think that that we have to keep in mind the general atmosphere and the general tensions in which the societies experienced the world within which they lived, and how it impacted on the emotional and social needs which have been addressed so incisively by several of your comments.
I would like to thank you as well. Okay, Mary, there is another comment, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer that one. I didn't mean it in that crude correlation sense. What I meant was that the way in which the Cold War goes affects what is possible within different states at different times, affects what official policies are, and what therefore people on the ground can do. And if you look at a number of Eastern European states in the 1980s, which is a quite distinct and different period from the 1950s or 1960s, you can see, I wouldn't call it a liberalization, but there is a variation of opinion becoming possible. There are more debates going on. And is that in part to do with the fact that they feel more secure after a longer period of time, or more to do with the fact that they're trying to construct distinctive national identities that are acceptable, or more to do with the fact that they're trying to make gestures towards rising voices of oppositional and not necessarily oppositional, but differing views, and make more space for these? All of these things you have to think about, both in relation to the wider Cold War, the way you suggested it, and also what it means for individuals who are trying to make their voice heard or trying to achieve something in their own lives. And that's where I think we need to put the wider context together with what's going on with subjectivities and cultural shifts.
Okay, Norbert.
Well, we are almost about at the end, but since I think I was the one who doubted the concept of Cold War the most, I should like to mention the chances the concept of Cold War also produced for, let's say, the West German society in the 1960s. Yeah, just the idea of that the Holocaust appeared somewhere in the East, and the East is put off by this Iron Curtain. That Auschwitz was, I mean, early in the 1990s, it was kind of something that Sybille Steinbacher in her dissertation came up with the fact that Auschwitz was on the Reich territory and was integrated to the Reich territory. I mean, this was simply not in the public conscious until then. Yeah, or all the other elements of doubt societies, people, perpetrators, lawyers of perpetrators could produce by arguing that this or that document comes from the East, or this argument comes from the East. So yes, of course, the Cold War was very much present in the 1950s and in the 1960s too, when it came to talking about the Holocaust and the Nazi past in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I could take this as a plea to have another conference on the Cold War and the Holocaust in Western Europe and the US and how it impacted there. That's not how you meant it, but it might serve as an appropriate or suitable conclusion to a great and, to me at least, extremely inspiring discussion. So, and thank you so much for your concluding remarks and your comments. And they give us much homework in thinking of what to do with this conference in a longer perspective to Sybille and me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much also from me. Thank you for your comments and your stimulating critique. Well, let me at the end give you some information and give our audience some information. You can read and listen to all the presentations and to all the panels on our conference website. The website will be online for the next week, so you have enough time to read and to listen. I want to thank at the end again very much Katharina Rauschenberger, Hanna Hecker, Werner Lott, Natalia, Natalie Schüler for all their engagement. This was a large effort. It was an amazing commitment to this conference. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And now I have to say goodbye to our external participants who followed us via YouTube.